We have new details tonight in the battle over the voter rolls in Georgia. Thousands of inactive Georgia voters will be removed. And this afternoon, a federal judge denied an injunction that would have prevented more than 100,000 inactive voters from being purged. Hope Ford has more on the decision and what will happen next.
Is it constitutional? That's the question in front of a federal judge tasked with overseeing the back and forth between the Stacey Abrams-led Fair Fight Action and Secretary of State Ben Raffensperger. And it started here with House Bill 316. The bill passed earlier this year increased how long a voter can remain inactive from 7 years to 9 years. But Raffensperger says House Bill 316 didn't apply to people who were already past the 7-year mark before the bill became law. Fair Fight says not so fast. Removing those people violates their constitutional rights. Ultimately, a federal judge ruled he can't force Georgia to follow a federal court's interpretation of a state law. The judge also says Fair Fight didn't prove the people removed had their constitutional rights violated. The judge says Fair Fight can go to a state court if they want. And the judge says the Secretary of State's office has to do more to warn people before they're removed. Fair Fight sent us this statement, saying in part, they appreciate the judge's order to push the state to warn people, and they're looking at other legal options. The Secretary of State's office sent their own statement, calling Fair Fight's lawsuit a waste of taxpayer dollars, and adding that Georgia is continuing to make sure the voter list remains accurate.
And Fair Fight says that their lawsuit allowed more than 26,000 people to remain on the voting rolls.